There's a revival project going around for what I would have to call one of my favorite live service games of all time, that the studio who developed it, called Yager, doesn't want you to know about. The game's been dead for years, and just recently I got tipped off that for the last 4 months, there's been a small group of hardcore fans trying to bring the game back from the dead, but the official developers really aren't too happy with it. In fact, they're so upset that apparently they're going as far as banning anybody who even remotely mentions it on the official Discord server, even though the game's been dead since 2023. And the interesting thing is that we've seen this sort of scenario play out with other dead games in the past, and usually there's a few different outcomes that can happen. So let's go ahead and try to get into the game and talk about what exactly happened to the Cycle Frontier. But just in case you've never heard of the Cycle Frontier, because it didn't really exactly break any records in terms of player count or anything, it was a PvPvE extraction shooter that was set in a futuristic sci-fi setting on the planet Fortuna 3. Your main hub was the Prospect Station, where players would go in and prepare before each raid. You had different factions to take quests from and gain reputation with them by completing missions, and the more you leveled up your reputation with the factions, the higher tier weapons and gear you could unlock and bring into the game. It was pretty easy to understand, highly addictive to consume, because you would go down to Fortuna 3 to loot the specific items that you need for each of your quests. You go against the hostile environment, you go against the alien mobs, and you have to watch out for other players in the map, and it's an extraction shooter, so you have to extract with your loot. I've never really been the best at extraction shooters, and usually I put in a couple of hours here and there, but the Cycle Frontier was the one that I put in probably the most amount of hours into. It was one of the very few games out there that actually managed to pull off that futuristic vibe and aesthetic properly, while also having that sense of tenseness, that tense feeling that you get when you're playing an extraction shooter. It almost made you feel like you were watching an alien horror movie, like the Alien movies or Prometheus or anything like that. The Cycle Frontier, though, was a lot more welcoming and easier to pick up, compared to other extraction shooters that are out there. Maybe that's why people loved it so much, because it's a genre that prides itself in being intentionally difficult and sometimes even tedious with its game mechanics, but in terms of accessibility and ease of learning how to play the game and how everything works, the Cycle Frontier was definitely one of the best for newcomers to the genre, and I think that this is the reason why so many people actually resonated with the Cycle Frontier, and why most likely there's currently a project trying to bring the game back from the dead, But this fan revival that we're talking about, there's definitely some problems that they have to deal with. So when fans try to revive a game like the Cycle Frontier, for example, it's not always about the nostalgic side of things, there's a whole conversation going around game preservation and not wanting these sort of experiences to end up being lost media. And I totally understand that from the gamer's perspective of wanting to keep the game alive and being able to revisit it whenever the hell you want, but it's also Yager's copyright protected IP that they have full legal rights to sit on and do absolutely nothing with. And that's where the tension lies here, because maybe they're not ready to give up on it yet, maybe they're working on their own official revival, or they just have those assets on reserve in case they want to build something completely new. The point is that this is just a pretty tricky topic to navigate, I've actually heard from a few live service developers that have worked on now dead games that one of the things that frustrates them the most, like the absolute most frustrating thing about this, wasn't that the game they were working on ended up being a commercial failure and the studio got shut down or anything like that. It's the fact that they have nothing to show their kids 10 to 20 years from now about all the cool things that they were working on. It's not like the older pieces of media, like you can get a copy of Echo the Dolphin for the Sega Dreamcast, for example, right? A game from a failed console that you can still pick up and show to your kids to this day. You can physically tell them, hey, I made this, come check it out. Yeah, that doesn't happen with live service and other sort of experiences that are only available through online servers. Usually once the developers pull the plug for good, it's gone forever. There are some cases, like for example with Spellbreak, where they released the game out to the public for people to be able to host their own games. After the official version shut down, they were like, here's the game, go play it, remember it, enjoy it for as long as you can. But unfortunately, when it comes to live service games, once it's dead, it's gone for good. Think about like Knockout City, Rumbleverse, Hyperscape, XDefy, and more recently Concord. Live service gaming has a pretty depressing future when you think about it, and I can totally see why people would want to find a way to still be able to log into their favorite dead games, even if it's just to walk around and remember all the good times that they had. So the fan revival project that we're talking about is called The Cycle Reborn. I went over to the community Discord server and I saw that it was getting hundreds of new users almost every single day. That clearly tells me that there's a massive interest in wanting to bring this game back to life. I remember it had a pretty dedicated fan base back in the day because of how unique the Cycle Frontier was, and from what I could see from just browsing around in the server, people are raving about this game. They're excited to drop back down into Fortuna 3 as a prospector, and from what I could dig up, the project is being handled by just a handful of volunteers who already managed to get a working single-player mode in just 4 months, and they also have a timeline of having multiplayer be added later this year too. But one important thing to mention is that the reason they're calling themselves volunteers on this project and aren't actively trying to sell it isn't just because they're doing it for the love of the game or because they don't really need any money or something. It's because I don't think they want to make the situation way worse from what it already is, I'm not saying that it's a bad thing that they're working on the Cycle Reborn, but a fan revival project like this one always operates under muddy waters because of the whole legality of the situation, right? Because technically they don't have permission to do this from Yager, the studio who created the Cycle Frontier, but at the same time, at least up to this point, Yager hasn't sent any cease and desist letters. They haven't tried to get the project shut down or anything, other than just silencing people who are talking about it on the official The Cycle Frontier Discord server. So the developers of The Cycle Frontier are actively aware that this is happening, but they haven't pulled the trigger and done anything about it yet. So the developers of the Cycle Reborn are pretty much just betting on the off chance that Yager won't do anything to try to stop the project and just let them coexist in peace. But anyways, yeah, I got the game running. Let me just show you guys a little bit of snippets of how the game looks like. Alright, so we can actually head down to Fortuna 3. We have Bright Sands, Crescent Falls, and Theris Island. Alright, so this is our first ever official drop on the unofficial revival of the Cycle Frontier. Past the tutorial, past, entering the main hub and everything. And that drop-down animation is honestly one of my favorites. So since I don't really have to worry about other players or anything, I don't really have to make, I don't have to worry about not making any sounds. Man, this place was such a beautiful landscape. This game really was my favorite extraction shooter of all time. And I'm not really the best at extraction shooters like I mentioned before. Okay, they actually drop things. Thank you. Yeah, in the current state in which the game is right now, you can't actually do any missions. There's no extraction points enabled, so the only way to get out of the planet is just by dying. It just feels kind of abandoned, but that's just obviously what you expect from being able to play an extraction shooter like this with no other players. But man, just being able to actually get back into the game, get a feel for like the weapons, see the NPCs running around. They put in immense hours of work just to be able to do this, and it kind of sucks, that at the end of the day, it just ended up getting shut down because it was in a format, a live service game that was just not viable, not profitable, unfortunately. It's actually really interesting that you're able to just take on a project like this, let's just casually bring back the Cycle Frontier from the dead. I'm not a game developer, so I don't know the amount of work it takes to do this sort of thing, but I can't imagine it's easy by any means, And it makes me wonder if there's someone out there currently working on trying to revive the original Cycle game before it became an extraction shooter. Did you guys know that? Before the Cycle Frontier, there was just The Cycle, which was a game that tried to jump on the Battle Royale bandwagon back in the day, but the developers really didn't like calling it a Battle Royale specifically, so they referred to The Cycle as a free-to-play, player versus environment versus player, first-person competitive quest shooter royale. So The Cycle failed originally because of a low player count, Turns out there's not that much interest in a F2P, PvE, VP, FPCQS royale. Yeah. So that's where the Cycle Frontier came into play. The Cycle Frontier was a complete rework of the game that made it into an extraction shooter to kind of hop on the train of like the Escape from Tarkov's, the Hunt Showdowns, because those genres at the time were very, very popular. They still kind of are, but back then they were more mainstream. So they overhauled a lot of the game systems to turn it into like this new age of the Cycle, but unfortunately that meant that a lot of the stuff that made the original Cycle so unique just got removed entirely to fit this new darker and grittier vibe that they were going for. Remember that extraction shooters are known for that feeling of tension, It's the stress of going down into a planet, trying to complete your missions and objectives, while knowing that you could be getting stalked or ambushed at any moment. That's like the exciting part of playing an extraction shooter. So not only did they have to change the tone of the game with the new extraction shooter elements, but they also changed the color palettes and the environment to make it, darker, grittier, scarier. But unfortunately, the Cycle Frontier ended up dying, just like the original Cycle, due to low player counts and a lot of other more important factors. The game suffered from a lot of, stability issues at launch and a very prominent, an annoyingly prominent cheating problem. And let me tell you that there's nothing more frustrating about extraction shooters than being in the middle of a raid and just losing all your gear because of a server hiccup. You disconnect, you reconnect, you're back in the lobby, you lost all your items. Or maybe, you thought you were getting outplayed by someone only to find out wait, they were just cheating. Unfortunately, this is a thing that happens to every single game in the extraction shooter genre. It's not specific to the Cycle Frontier, but because this isn't Fortnite where you're not really risking anything when you get into a match, then those two situations can really kill an entire game. And Yager had a lot to deal with when the game first came out because they were trying to balance, making sure that the game was alive and running well while also handling all the cheaters. And unfortunately, if you go based off the Steam charts, you can actually see that the game had a solid start, but it just literally died almost immediately. It just nosedived. And although Yager Studios did eventually iron out the cheating problem by implementing a proper anti-cheat, and they fixed a lot of the game's core stability issues, well, unfortunately, the damage was already done. A lot of the players had already moved on to bigger and better things, and the player count, unfortunately, never recovered, even after all the updates that Yager added into the game, leading to the eventual shutdown of the Cycle Frontier on September 27th, 2023. So how does this all tie into what could eventually happen to the Cycle Reborn? Well, if you take a look at what other studios have dealt with in the past when it comes to fan revival projects, you could get a situation like what happened with Rumbleverse, for example, where they had a fan revival project, a small team of developers trying to revive the game after it died, and then Iron Galaxy Studios hit them with the good old cease and desist. The game wasn't even fully revived yet or anything, it was just a small Discord server, but the original IP holders were just not messing around with that. I guess they want to keep the game buried and dead on the ground. And that's a pretty harsh reality check that it doesn't matter how much the fans want something or how much they enjoyed it in the past, the developers hold the key to the castle at the end of the day. But then there's also the flip side of things where maybe Yager sees how much the community is supporting this fan revival and they see all the people that are trying to get back into Fortuna 3 and they either let it coexist in peace or find a way to get involved with them too. A good example of this is Toontown Rewritten, which is a fan revival project of Toontown Online. And Disney's had their issues with fan revival projects in the past, but at least with this one, they haven't obviously said that they 100% support it, but they haven't taken it down, so it's safe to assume that they're just letting it be. As long as they don't monetize it, as long as it's just the fans trying to keep the legacy of the game alive, they don't seem to have a problem with it. So yeah, if something like that were to happen to the Cycle Reborn, honestly, I think that would be the best case scenario for them. Maybe the developers will look at the Cycle Reborn and just try to ignore it, acknowledge it's there, but just let them do their own thing. Maybe the development of the Cycle Reborn will get to the point where we can actually get online multiplayer and PvP, because, I gotta say, as nostalgic as I feel for the Cycle Frontier, getting back into the game and kind of just wandering around an empty map with a few NPCs here and there, it's only half the experience, The other half is that feeling of tension you get when you're playing an extraction shooter, and that's where all the fun is. One is just the concept of like, wow, this is cool, the map is beautiful. The other one is just like, okay, where are the bad guys at? Let's go get some kills or something. Let's go extract after eliminating a few enemies here and there. We'll just have to wait and see what happens, what becomes of the Cycle Reborn, and that's all I really wanted to talk about with you guys. So thank you guys for watching.